I want to kind of give you a little bit of an overhead of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to talk a little bit about quantum computers, talk a little bit about the current myth that is out there, what people are thinking, and I want to kind of relate why are we so interested in this from a PKI perspective. We'll talk a little bit about the history of crypto. It's not really a deep dive, but to kind of give you a sense for why this is an important thing. But more importantly, I want to give all the attendees some actionable things they can do today. So regardless of where you are in the spectrum of believing in the quantum supremacy concern, or perhaps you do believe in it, but you are a protagonist and you kind of think it's a little farther down the road. I want to give you some tools that you could start with today, because frankly, this is a problem that isn't going to be addressed overnight. And then obviously we'll get to some questions. So let's start with the myth. Pretty much what we can see out there from news articles and information and the scant amount of details that we have, as well as just the water cooler chit chat, is that because of quantum computers, all encryption, as we know, is going to end. It just encryption and signatures and data protection and privacy are going to go out the window because of quantum computers. It's just magically going to appear. Everything that we have, everything that we protect is suddenly going to be unprotected. And, then the world just kind of falls apart. It's not quite that bleak, but that's kind of what we wind up seeing in a lot of places. And it ultimately kind of comes back to the fact that we're still really kind of dealing with theories. There's no real proven quantum computer that has existed today that somebody's been able to take a commercial level set of encryption standards like RSA at 1024 or 2048 and actually demonstrate that this is going to work. It's kind of based on the assumption that Shor's algorithm will actually prove out and that quantum computers will be able to achieve this quantum supremacy, essentially get to a point where they will be able to take any piece of information that's been encrypted or signed and be able to easily read that information or provide that information in clear text. Now, this ultimately kind of goes back to a core issue. We know that quantum computers are coming. We know that they physically exist and that people are working with them. But there's a lot of fundamental challenges still. And an interesting comparison here is if you remember the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, they build the universe's biggest computer. They ask it the really big question, what's the meaning of life, the universe, and everything? And it comes back and says 42. We're still at that stage that not only do we have quantum computers and we're trying to figure them out, we're still trying to figure out how to ask them the right questions. Ask them a question that only a quantum computer can do, and they're not just acting like a super fast computer. The whole concern that we have around the quantum space is just how it operates and how it fundamentally changes one of the basic tenets of encryption and signatures. So where are we at right now in the overall state? We know that right now they haven't spelled the end of encryption. We know they exist, but they're at a very, very small scale. There's different ways of judging where we are in the evolution. Historically, it's been based on qubits, or the number of raw computation modules that exist in there. There's a new kind of standard that IBM has put out there that kind of factors in bigger things around error state, the results, as well as the number of qubits. So we're still even trying to figure out how to judge how large these things are and who has something that's more powerful. We also know that organizations like Microsoft and other ones have already started coming out with things like quantum programming languages, which is kind of an interesting thing of how do you write a programming language for an underlying infrastructure that doesn't exist yet. But they have very defined plans to offer quantum computing as a service, that they're really seeing this as a cloud forward option for them, which is an interesting thing. The last time that we had such a drastic breakthrough of computing, and you think back to IBM, and I believe they famously said they thought there was a market of about 12 mainframes in the world. In this case, we're almost kind of starting in the reverse place that, yes, they may be very large and expensive, but it actually may be very easy for organizations to get to them through cloud services. We're also at the state where we don't really know what the timeline is. No one can really tell us if we are days, months, weeks, years, or decades away from this point. And it's really referred to as quantum supremacy. When quantum computers can get to a point where they are able to function at a level that far exceeds what we can do with traditional computers. In the encryption space, this is specific to, can they get to a point where in very short order, can they break traditional encryption? So what I want to do is, rather than making this a session about quantum computers are coming, they're bad, everything's going to end, no, don't bother protecting your information, I want this to be a call to action, because there are certain things that, frankly, you could and should be doing today in preparation for quantum computing. And whether that supremacy comes 6 months from now, or 6 years from now, or 20 years from now, the work that you're going to do still is directly related to what you're going to need to do when those quantum computers are actually at that point. So what are the steps that you can do to actually ready yourself for quantum computers? Well, one is to realize, what does that really mean? So first of all, when we talk about quantum supremacy, is we're really talking about the ability for a quantum computer to take some piece of encrypted information and in very short order, decrypt that information. So it is theorized that what could take hundreds of thousands of years for a traditional computer to break, say something like RSA 2048, should, in theory, only take a few seconds on a quantum computer. That essentially makes that encryption worthless. If I'm encrypting something, the odds are I want that to be around for more than just a few seconds, which means I have a potential exposure to quantum computers. Now, the reason it goes to this, if you want to have a little interesting aside, go read a little bit about RSA and the origins of the encryption. Basically, the most modern type of encryption that we use, aside from, say, ECC, the most prevalent encryption is RSA encryption. And it's basically based on a mathematical fluke. There's something inherently difficult for computers to do, and that's around factoring prime numbers. The public key, private key aspect, and this is how it's directly related to us in PKI, is RSA is an asymmetric encryption. It has a public key and a private key. You actually have 50% of the information you need to solve this puzzle. It's solved for X. Well, quantum computers can very easily do this. Essentially, in the public key is all of the information you need to be able to compute the private key. It's just exceptionally hard for computers to do it. We call it a time-based challenge. Well, if I can figure out what that private key is in a matter of seconds, that information really isn't protected. So what we want to do from a steps perspective is start assessing your environment, figure out what systems you have that do encryption. And frankly, this is a challenge we run into with organizations, even regardless of the quantum space. When we look at public key infrastructure upgrades, or we're changing crypto, a lot of organizations, frankly, don't do a great job figuring out what type of systems they have and what type of encryption they're doing. There's just a lot of servers, there's a lot of appliances, things have been turned on. No one really has a centralized list. Well, if we're going to figure out what needs to be remediated someday because of quantum supremacy, we need to know what systems are out there. So this is actually something that, yes, it's a big undertaking, it's a big task. Start it today. If quantum supremacy is 2 years off, guess what? You have a 2-year head start on this. So this isn't something that has to be finished overnight, but you got to start somewhere, and you got to start at some point. So just start by making a simple spreadsheet. What systems do you have? We have Windows computers, we have Linux systems, we have F5 systems, and just start writing down what you do and start collecting information from other people. Then you can start building off of that to figure out what type of encryption and crypto keys are they using. Are they using our Sorry about that. So once you have your environment where you've determined what systems you have, start figuring out what types of crypto keys are they doing. Do they use RSA? Do they use ECC? They can basically start building that list of understanding what systems you have and what type of cryptography you're actually using in your environment. So now that you've got this list, we also want to start figuring out what's your risk exposure. By looking across your organization, you can start to get a sense for which of my systems are going to be a higher risk. Something, say, facing the public internet, sitting as an external gateway or communicating with the outside world, is a much greater risk exposure than something that is internal to our organization and is, say, a employee website. It may be using the same amount of cryptography, but the information it's transmitting is perhaps less sensitive, and it's also not likely to be actually accessible over the internet. So this is something that will give us some sense of priority and scale. So far we've collected what are our systems, what types of keys are they using, and where are they in our risk exposure perspective. Again, these are great remediation things to have on hand if there's ever a compromise or you're looking at improving your cryptography or just getting a handle on what is happening in your environment. And yes, it also does a great job of preparing you for the post-quantum space. We then want to take those systems and start figuring out which of them have no upgradable options. If we have legacy systems, we deal with customers that have custom code that source code's been long lost. It could be old hardware or old systems that manufacturer just has no upgrade option around. Guess what? There's no great option there. You're going to have to start either figuring out, can the manufacturer give you a replacement product? And if so, what's the timeline to give you something that will have a improvement to the cryptography space? Or we need to start looking for alternatives. And that's why getting started on this now, if you could find out that one of your core business systems is a legacy state and the manufacturer, maybe they don't even exist anymore, you may need a couple years to find a replacement that will give you the option to be able to run current cryptography, but also move to something that's new. If you waited until that big flag comes out and quantum supremacy is here, you're suddenly still looking at that same timeline, but now you're 2 or 3 years out to remediation. So by starting now, you can start figuring out which of your systems are going to be susceptible, what's their priority, and then what is our option? Do we upgrade them? Do we have to find an alternate option? Once we've kind of got this landscape of what all these systems are, we want to start figuring out our timeline. Are there some systems that we can upgrade today that have quantum resistant algorithms? NIST is still kind of working on the standard recommendations, but there are already quantum resistant algorithms that are out there. Truth be told, it's difficult to prove that they're not going to be susceptible. They just rely on something other than the prime number factoring, and they are believed to be quantum resistant. But you can start implementing those in critical places today where you've got that capability. If there are systems that are going to need a year or 2 years or even 5 years, put that in your roadmap and make sure that you're marching towards that with a clear understanding of when will you get to the point that your quantum resistance is in place to protect your organization. And we ultimately want to make sure that we are understanding our critical systems. What is the most vulnerable parts of our organization? And oftentimes that's the stuff that's facing the internet, things that are providing authentication, business critical systems, things that are protecting information from a regulatory standpoint. We want to make sure that we're providing the right priorities for those systems so that we can make sure that if we are going to have some type of a compromise or some type of a impact from quantum computing, that we're adequately addressing those before that supremacy date occurs. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is none of us are really in a state anymore of dealing with on-premise only organizations. They're very few and far between. What that means is you're probably dealing with third parties and cloud services. This is no longer just a question of what servers do I run, what kind of hardware do I have, what kind of appliances do I have. It's ultimately my organization exists in many different places. I need to have conversations with my vendors and I need to find out what are their plans. My information, my services that are sitting in Azure or AWS or Google Cloud or whatever those are, they could also be hosted managed services for something specific to your business. you need to find out, what are they going to do? Because frankly, they may not even necessarily want to be addressing this question until they have to. They may just simply take a wait and see, because if no one's asking them to do it, what's in their fiscal interest in addressing it today until they have to do it? And it's frankly what we see from any type of a external relationship. If we don't hold them to meet our standards, then their timelines may be very different than ours. So we need to make sure that we are figuring out our systems that are on premise and the cloud. And then we need to kind of figure out, how are we going to encourage them? We want to start having conversations with those third parties, Microsoft OneDrive, AWS, like whatever those things are, and reach out and say, what is your timeline? And if they can't give you a defined timeline, that goes into your tracking sheet and says, no, we've got the following services. They're in Azure, undefined as far as what those new crypto things are going to be. And then that continues to be something you address. And just like those other areas, if they don't give you an upgrade option, if they don't give you a remediation option, then you could also start looking for, well, what would give us certainty? Are there alternate options, alternate cloud providers that will give you some flexibility or crypto agility to start using stronger encryption, or maybe they're already available today? So the point here is we want to make sure that we think beyond just the on-premise approach and think about the cloud providers as well as anywhere else that we have our information. This could even be our partners and vendors and subcontractors that are processing information for us, that are transmitting information for us. All of those should be part of the same spectrum. And yes, it makes the puzzle much bigger, but regardless, whether you do the problem today or you wait until the day before quantum supremacy, it doesn't get any easier. It's really a factor of time. So what are some of the key questions? As you're going through and you're creating your list, we want to figure out, are there systems that can't be upgraded or augmented? And here's a really interesting approach that you can take. Just because a system can't be upgraded or doesn't give you the agility that you need, there may be an alternate way of solving this problem. Not everything is just rip it out and put something else in. So as an example, let's imagine you've got some business process that runs on a server on your premise and transmits information to some commercial provider that you have. And for some reason, that platform just won't give you any type of agility. It's non-upgradable, and it's just not going to get replaced. Well, what if, rather than having to replace that product, we say, you know what we're really trying to do is protect the information from our location to that customer's location. What if we wrap that inside of something that is quantum resistant? What if we deploy a firewall or a tunnel protocol that goes between our location and the provider's location? And inside of it, yes, we've got our RSA or elliptical curve or whatever sitting inside of there that's vulnerable, but it's wrapped inside of something else that's quantum resistant. So even if it gets sucked up on the internet and someone throws it at a quantum computer, they can't see it because it's inside of that quantum resistance. So we may be able to augment our systems by tunneling them or wrapping that information inside of something else. You could do the same systems, file protection systems. There may be something that just isn't going to give you the flexibility that you need. Well, think about wrappers. Can we put something else around it from that risk profile? Or steps. If it's an internal website and it can't be upgraded, well, maybe that's not a real critical thing. You let it go and you know it's somewhere on your list. The things that are going over the internet and could potentially be scooped up at any moment, that's the stuff to start tunneling. And an interesting aside on that matter, there's already theoretical concerns around essentially harvest and digest. Essentially, the amount of information that flows over the internet that has very sensitive information could easily be scooped up and stored. If it has long-term value, things like social security numbers, credit cards, state secrets, intellectual patents, copyrights, recipes, all those sorts of things, that they traditionally have a long-term value, that if I scoop all that stuff up and I can't read it for 5 years, well, it's still valuable 5 years from now. So there's some concern that if you are in a place where you are moving information that could potentially be damaging, say 5 or 10 years down the road when quantum supremacy comes along, it may make sense to start thinking about some of that tunneling today, even if the direct systems themselves aren't upgraded. We also want to figure out, are there any kind of practices that we need to change? Are there certain things around how we're updating and encrypting information? Who's doing the updating? Are there any places where we are using BYOK, for instance? Are we using Azure or AWS and bringing our own key? What will happen to those services and our encryption keys that we're using if we want to move to something stronger? Will those providers allow us to bring a stronger key or an alternate algorithm to that process? And then lastly is really thinking about, what is your 0-day timeline? Once you've identified all these systems, you should be able to get a sense for how long will it take to remediate them. Is that 6 months worth of work? Is it 5 years worth of work? And think about, if you didn't do any of that today and quantum supremacy was announced someday, well, you're now potentially going to be operating for that amount of time with essentially unprotected, unencrypted information. If you have a 5-year 0-day timeline, that means once quantum supremacy is achieved, that you could potentially have all your information exposed for 5 years. Now, here's the tough part. We know about a certain number of quantum computers out there. I would suspect that based on previous experiences, that there's probably more quantum computers and quantum updates that are really occurring behind closed government doors than we'll probably ever hear about. So just because we hear certain things about Google and NSA doesn't really mean that's the latest and greatest. So the final takeaways: make sure you monitor and evaluate what's happening in the post-quantum space. This stuff is changing very rapidly. It's not necessarily day by day, but you should at least have an eye on what's happening in the growth and maturity of quantum computers. You want to make sure that you're able to adapt and change to new algorithms as they're available. That's where the list of systems and capabilities come from. You want to make sure that you're starting dialogues with your partners and vendors and suppliers. Anyone that you're going to be working with is make sure that you started that dialogue process now to find out where you're going to have options and where you're not. And lastly, don't panic. This isn't going to happen tomorrow, but there is a lot of work, and it's something that you could easily get started right now. I would challenge you at the end of the summit today, you could probably start a spreadsheet and name at least 5 things that are critical to your business that you could start putting into a spreadsheet and tracking. And with that, we can open up to any kind of questions that you may have. If we don't get to them, do feel free to reach out to me on social media or email, and I'd be happy to take them.